Hello and welcome to a special episode of Planet Critical following the election of a fascist to the United States government. I asked Emily Atkin of Heated, one of the most important and prolific independent media sources on climate, to join me and talk about what a Trump presidency means for climate action. And it won't surprise any listener of this podcast to learn not good. The answer is it's not looking good. Emily explains what Heated already reported on around Project 2025 and the policies to repeal regulation and climate legislation, and what Trump has said himself he will do. She explains how Elon Musk got involved in Trump's campaign and explains why the United States climate hero has built a relationship with a coal billionaire. She also explains what Biden could do in the next 2 months, both nationally and at COP29 next week, to attempt to protect against the worst of Trump's plans. And finally, we end discussing what the media could do differently with regards to how it reports on climate change in order to connect it to the reality of people's lives, which are hard at the moment. I'm happy to report there's a huge amount of laughter in this episode, facing down the barrel of the climate void, which has just deepened overnight. Because if you can't laugh, you'll cry. And so what else are climate reporters expected to do at this juncture? The big takeaways from this are we need to get organized, we need new ideas, and we need to stay on top of what's happening. And a really good place to start is Heated. Go and subscribe at heated.world. Support them if you can. And then if you haven't already, head back over to planetcritical.com to subscribe there, where we'll be back with our regular programming next week. Emily, welcome to Planet Critical. It is a pleasure, and also it's a sad day to have you on the show today.
It's not the episode that I wanted to do, I'll be frank with you.
It really, really isn't. So you know the first question. Everybody listening knows the first question that I give everyone, but you get a special version today, which is, Emily, why is America in crisis?
America just elected a fascist climate denier to lead its country for the next 4 years, and it's unclear if he'll even leave office after those 4 years. There's this sense of dread about what is even, there's always the feeling of, well, it's only 4 years of this administration that we don't like for whatever reason. I'm speaking, of course, in my capacity as a climate change reporter, so it's not controversial to say that this is a really catastrophic outcome for the global climate. That's, that's an unbiased assessment. But there's always that feeling of, okay, well, it's just 4 years and we're in this wild situation where is it just 4 years? What will happen? And that's not only because of how Trump has said that he might not leave, but also I think this election was just such a blowout for Republicans and for the Democratic Party, which unfortunately is the only party that accepts climate science, which I wish were the case. But that it's even if Trump does leave after 4 years, it's how is this party going to reckon with the fact that nobody really wanted them? Nobody wanted the only party that was even a little bit dedicated to climate action. And they weren't even that much dedicated to climate action. So, America is certainly in a spot.
America is in a spot, and as you said, has put the entire world in a spot. There's lots of graphs circulating at the moment from Carbon Brief who show that 1.5 is dead now. 1.5 has kind of been, I would say, most climate scientists have been saying, it looks like we're not going to make it already within this year. But now it's any goals or attempts to meet it have just been blown out of the water, because it's likely Trump will pull us out of the Paris Agreement again. And as you said, rather than believing in climate science, denies climate crisis entirely and has a heavily detailed document about how they're going to strip back climate protection and regulation.
It's interesting. So I was late to this interview. Your listeners won't know that, but I was 12 minutes late to this interview because I was I'm editing an article that has to go out today, and I have to get done with it. And that article is headlined 1.5C is dead. The climate fight is not. And so in that article, Heated's enterprise reporter Ariel Samuelson talks to 9 climate scientists and policy experts about what the situation is now that we have a Trump administration. Just scientifically for the planet, we do quote the Climate Central Carbon Brief, the Carbon Brief graphs, and the author of those studies about Trump's potential impact on the global climate. And yeah, I mean, I guess the one silver lining is that, yeah, it was already kind of dead. Now, 1.5. Yeah.
What a world.
Ariel talked to at least one scientist who I would say he tends on the pessimistic range. Andrew Dessler from Texas A&M University. You might have talked to him before. He's very.
I haven't.
He likes that. It's a good thing about him, honestly, because we need more climate scientists like that. He's like down to talk to media whenever, and that's helpful for us when we're on deadline. But he tends to lead pessimistic, and he said that he still thinks 2 degrees Celsius is not probable. What did he say? Plausible. He said he thinks it's plausible. He thinks it's reasonable. We can go into reasons if you want, but it's not like that's much of a comfort. It's not, but I don't think that, I don't know, what I've really understood from being engaged in climate change for so many years is that like it's never comfortable, it's never soothing, it's always harm reduction. And so 2C is shitty, but it's not 2.1C, it's not 2.2C. Every single fraction of a degree, like it doesn't matter. So there's still, it's tough to hear 1.5C is dead and not be like, oh well, fuck it, right? But there is still a lot. There's still a lot of there in terms of what can be done to prevent more harm, more death, more economic impact, more ecological destruction.
The fight must never end, absolutely, because there are always more marginalized people who it's affecting already. And I think even the kind of, how do I put this? The presenting numbers as goals and making the gaps between the numbers so big scientifically, like the difference between 1.5 and 2 is huge, and that totally kind of falls into essentially what the fossil fuel companies want, which is like, oh, if we feel like we can give up at 1.5, then the next target we set will be 2, which doesn't seem like much to the layman, but is huge scientifically. It's huge. The fight absolutely must continue. I want to know if you have, I know you've spent the past 24 hours speaking with activists and scientists about what to do. And I definitely, if we have time at the end, want to speak about that. But what happens now? Because HETA did a special series on Project 2025, the policy plan that was created by Heritage Foundation, which has links to the Atlas Network, about what they would do with the Trump presidency. And it was terrible for climate. So what are we looking at in the next, cross fingers, hopefully only 4 years? What do we know are the plans that have been set out thus far with regards to climate?
I mean, there's Project 2025, and then there are the things that Trump himself has promised, and a lot of those things are the same. I think, we're looking at a withdrawal, of course, from the Paris climate agreements, which is what happened the first time. We've COP29 coming up in like a week. So the U.S. will be in one more round of climate talks, I think, before we're not at all. I wouldn't be surprised if the Trump administration pulled us out of all international climate diplomacy, which is a blow because the U.S. has been shown to, when it is engaging in climate talks, to be able to pressure on their major polluters to also increase their goals. And so that dynamic is likely going to shift. And those, obviously climate change is a global problem. The global scale negotiations are extremely important. I remember in the first Trump administration, Trump didn't pull us out of all climate negotiation, but sometimes the U.S. delegation would send like coal representatives. So that's almost even worse. It's like the difference between a group project and there's somebody there that's actively not participating and somebody there that's actively being like, we should do something dumb instead, right? You're like, I'd almost rather you not be there. So I'm worried about that.
Yeah.
The things that are like very easy and in Trump's power and that he's done before, which makes it very easy to say that like, I'm pretty sure this is going to happen again, is an immediate attempt to roll back the regulatory state on power plants, vehicles, refineries, LNG export terminals. I don't know how familiar your listeners are with those, but the Biden administration implemented a new set of regulations to stop new permits for LNG export facilities. Those are these like huge, massive gas infrastructure, offshore behemoths. And, you know, they're carbon bombs. There's no better way to describe them. And so, you know, Trump has talked openly about repealing that regulation, repealing regulations to make car manufacturers have their cars not pollute so much, which is huge because transportation is the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. right now. And obviously that's driven by mostly cars and big polluting cars. You know, America loves our like big polluting SUVs. You know, carbon regulations on power plants, all those types of things. There will be court fights over those things that generally take a long time, but that's something that's number one within Trump's power in the executive branch and likely for him to do. Then there's the Inflation Reduction Act. There are all of the clean energy investments, the hundreds of millions of dollars in clean energy investments that the Biden administration put forward via the Inflation Reduction Act. That there's also tax credits in there for renewable energy development, incentives to spur solar development, battery development, clean vehicle development, wind energy, you name it. The repealing of those tax credits, Trump has explicitly said he wants to repeal wind energy tax credits. Project 2025 has proposals to repeal other clean energy tax credits. So Trump himself hasn't said, I want to repeal solar battery tax credits, but Project 2025 has. Those would be probably the most significant policy repeals that Trump could do. He would need the support of Congress in order to do that. But there is an analysis that we reported on about 2 weeks ago from like a nonpartisan global power analytics firm that does these things just for power companies that said that the repeal of these tax credits could inhibit renewable energy development by 212 gigawatts, which is like a massive amount. I'm offhand, I don't like know how much a gigawatt is, but 212 gigawatts is something like 600 Hoover dams or something like that. I don't actually have the number off the top of my head, but it's more than,
I do.
Yeah, it's like, you do.
I do because I read your report. Yeah. I read your report and I noted it down. Yeah. So this is from your Project 2025 series, and it is 159 million homes. That's the equivalent. Yeah, powering 159 million homes by 2040.
By 2040. So imagine that. Right now, it's about to be 2025. In 15 years, you know, with these tax credits that have already been implemented, that's saying that we could have, in 15 years in the U.S., 135 million homes worth of renewable energy, more than we have now. That's more than all the homes we have. Yeah. We have what, like 300 million people? And then we have about less than half of that many households. So that would be a catastrophic outcome. I don't think there's any way to sugarcoat that. The only silver lining about that is that so much of that funding has gone to Republican states, red states. So, and it would have to go through Congress. So a lot of Republicans who have districts that are benefiting from these funds and these tax credits in particular would have to go against a certain amount of constituency in that area. Now, With the results of this last election, I don't doubt Americans' ability to go against their best interest, particularly the number of women that voted for Trump. What I've learned from covering this election, covering the last election, covering the 2016 election is that like stuff that you think would make sense, just it doesn't. Like you're like, oh, voters would who have this in their interests, like who have all this money, they would never support X, and that's not what drives politics in this country. There's like weird other cultural forces, and so I wouldn't be surprised. Anti-climate change, anti-renewable energy sentiments are high among the right leaning of this country. It's been so villainized culturally, this idea of a Green New Deal and this idea of trying to kill the oil industry for no reason, quote unquote, right? Because climate denial is so rampant as well. So, I wouldn't be surprised. I have spoken in my career to coal miners who, when presented with the option of, their industry is declining, would you be open to taking a job in renewable energy? Who have said straight up no. Like that is it's a cultural, it doesn't matter if the job would pay them more or pay them the same. It's like they see it as a betrayal. And so there are just so many more forces other than logic, reason, and even money going into some of these climate policies and why not they're being adopted. So those are the big ones, I'd say. There's a ton of other little stupid ones and those are the big
one.
ones.
I'd just like to bring up from another one of your pieces on the Project 2025 series was the wildfire protection, which was rather than implement policies to protect against wildfires that protect forests and protect the growth of forests, it would be just to log them essentially and ensure that they can be sold off, which is such a beautifully awful emblem, I think, of what we can expect from this presidency, which is rather than protecting that which needs to be protected, figuring out ways to use crisis and catastrophe to profiteer. I want to ask your opinion on what you think the relationship with Elon Musk, who is a clean tech billionaire, could possibly do to this administration, because you reported it heated on the connection between the coal billionaire, whose name I can't remember, and Elon, and I'd love for you to speak on that. But given Elon's entire business model essentially is built on clean technology, it seems odd that he would then support, the person who wants to repeal tax cuts and roll down essentially the implementation of this stuff.
Yeah, this has been one of the, I think as a reporter, the most interesting storylines to come out of this election is like Elon Musk, who used to literally tear up and start crying when talking about how serious climate change is. His embrace of Trump and his embrace of coal, his embrace of fossil fuels. It's kind of been wild. It's like, so the coal billionaire that you're talking about is Joseph Kraft, who runs Alliance Resource Partners. He was hugely influential in the first Trump administration. And he was one of the biggest donors to Elon Musk's PAC. He did reported that a couple weeks ago. And that was just so strange. We thought that was so strange because Elon Musk's whole business model it literally says in Tesla's master plan that one of the key pillars is to eliminate fossil fuels. In Australia, Tesla helped, I think it was Southern Australia, close down its last coal plant because Tesla, as your listeners might know, doesn't just make EVs, it makes solar panels and batteries as well. So it didn't make any sense to me. The closest that I could get to it was that to like a why is that if electricity demand grows big enough, then I think Musk sees an opportunity for his business to grow and fossil fuels to continue to grow as well. And if he just aligns with them, then they can both work towards both of their businesses growing at the same time. Then the things that are really growing electricity demand are not just EVs, which are obviously growing demand, but artificial intelligence and cryptocurrency. So as long as the demand for electricity is growing so fast as driven by crypto and AI, the grid will need both of them, right?
Right.
And because, renewables just aren't growing fast enough to meet that huge increase in electricity demand. Alliance Resource Partners, the coal company that is heavily invested in Elon Musk's PAC, is staying afloat right now by mining Bitcoin. That's like their other revenue source other than mining coal. They mine coal and then they use the excess electricity from those plants to mine Bitcoin. And so Alliance Resource Partners has mined $30 million worth of Bitcoin in the last 4 years, and that's helped them cover their operating expenses. At the same time, you listen to their earnings call as I was just doing, and they talk about how like this increase in demand for Bitcoin and for AI is improving their projections, is making them feel like, okay, we're in a much better spot than we expected to be. And I don't know if you saw, but as soon as Trump was reelected, Bitcoin prices soared. I mean, they absolutely soared. Trump has promised to make Elon Musk the head of a new government agency called the Department of Government Efficiency, which stands for DOGE. That's Doge. That's Elon Musk's favorite cryptocurrency is Dogecoin. So I think that there's like a huge connection. This is just something I caught on to like 2 weeks ago, trying to figure out why is this coal billionaire Joe Kraft donating to Elon Musk's PAC of all people, right? Mm-hmm. And finding their connections through cryptocurrency. I think that there are big plans for the cryptocurrency industry. And I think that those plans stand to increase the amount of electricity demand, which stands to benefit both Musk and the fossil fuel corporations that are supporting Trump and Trump's administration.
Good God. That's brilliant. Not for us, I mean, but a brilliant series of joining the dots. Because we're really kind of getting off territory, I suppose, of what both of us kind of specialize in. But I have heard that there are also ideas to tie the US dollar to crypto, because and I can't really get my head around why exactly, because it's not really tied to anything, right?
It's kind of annoying, right? It's like how many things have I had to understand as a reporter to be able to understand global climate policy and global climate negotiations, and now I have to understand fucking Bitcoin. God, like. That's fine. I'm so frustrated.
Oh God, that's brilliant. Okay, great. I mean, what bits of it do you get? Because I can't really get my head around it unless it's connected to this increasing in electricity demand to increase the amount of resources.
Yeah, it's like a MLM, like Herbalife. It's just some bullshit white dude thing that they like to trade in, like Pokemon cards or whatever. But it's like billions of dollars, and I don't know. I understand it a little more than that, but that's really like every time I'm like reading and understanding it, there's that like little clock that's going like, fuck, you have to understand Pokemon Go again, like.
Oh God. I've been in an absolute hole since the election was announced, and I thought that I had a different image for what this podcast could be, but it was exactly what I needed.
Yes, no problem. No problem. No, the first time I had to like learn about Bitcoin was, I remember in 2017, I wrote an article for the New Republic about concerns that Bitcoin would use a lot of electricity and increase coal demand. And I remember that was the first time I had ever reported on it. And so I had to understand what the blockchain was. And then not only did I have to understand it, I had to try to explain it to people that were not, that had never heard of it before. And that was very difficult. So, and that was also 7 years ago now. So yeah, in order to do this story, I had to like wipe off like the book of blockchain Bitcoin in my brain and be like, because I've been trying to avoid paying attention to it, but yeah.
Yeah, I thought it would go away too. So it could be, so this attempt or this idea to tie the US dollar to Bitcoin could be connected to this desire to increase demand for electricity generation and thus coal and also, the clean tech if it's owned by, the guy who's in bed with the other guys.
I mean, electricity demand obviously needed to go up, right? Because if the solution to climate change is to electrify everything, is to make renewables be able to power everything, then it must be electrified. And so and it's one thing to electrify the economy, the pre-AI, the pre-cryptocurrency economy. That's a ton of demand, right? It's another thing to then pile on all this new tech demand. That really stretches it was already going to be a stretch. And now you're like, oh God, and so we have to power all of this with electricity too. That's a lot to ask from renewables. And I'm not saying that like renewables can't do it, but I'm definitely saying that they can't do it as quickly as they could if the demand were lower. And there's this taboo about talking about demand. It's like you can't, it's especially in American political circles where capitalism is king, right? Like demand growth is always good. It's never bad to have more growth, right? And if you understand climate change, you're sort of like, well, at a certain point, don't you think that maybe it would be good if we didn't have so much demand growth because we have so many things we need to decarbonize, right? But it's such a taboo subject. But yeah, I know. I do think that there's a connection between between at least Elon Musk and this coal billionaire and the demand for electricity benefiting both of them. I don't know yet about tying Bitcoin to the dollar just because I haven't done enough research into it. But that's something I would say is worth looking into.
Definitely. It has been floated from what I see as an idea by people linked to Project 2025. And if I remember correctly, I think JD Vance made some noise about it as well a couple of weeks ago, or maybe on some stupid podcast. But yes, I'll have to confirm my sources on that. And I think what's so kind of interesting is like the ideology that you were referring to at the beginning of this conversation, because they could just increase demand by decarbonizing what exists. You don't have to add things to increase demand, but there's this almost desire to like control, because to decarbonize would be to admit climate science, and it would be to admit that fossil fuels need to go, and would be to admit that we've had a problem and admit that we need to change and admit that the future could be different. And so it's almost like a way of kind of ignoring the correct solution, which would benefit everybody, even them, and still have some kind of not just material control over what's going on, but control over the ideology that's driving it as well.
Yeah, and I can see how somebody like Elon Musk, who is literally the richest person on earth, I know that changes day to day because we have so many mega billionaires, which is so great for everybody, and I love it. I just love it so much. I can see how he could maybe slip in his ideology about climate change and that being a concern if he sees an opportunity to grow his business while growing the businesses of other companies and other industries that are also helping him politically achieve the political situation that he wants. Obviously, you can't You cannot be an ally to the Trump administration and not be an ally to the fossil fuel industry. Those two things are the same thing, right? So if Musk sees a benefit in the Trump administration, working with the Trump administration, that means that he also sees the benefit in working with the fossil fuel industry, solely because those two things cannot be separated, and they will never be separated.
So, Emily, what happens next? What do we have to do in the next? I mean, first of all, actually, what can Biden do in his final 2 months to attempt to mitigate against what's coming with regards to climate? And then what do we as a people do in the next, hopefully just 4 years, to ensure that whatever steps we are taking together is towards a different future after this?
You know, I haven't, for some reason, I think it's just because there's so many stories that I can pursue, and like it's generally just me and one other person, but I haven't done too much reporting myself on like what exactly happens when the Biden administration or any administration declares a climate emergency.
Okay.
But I do know that that's a huge talking point among climate activists, saying that one thing Biden can do is declare a climate emergency. And I think that what that likely means is that declaring a national emergency of some kind frees up a bunch of emergency funding,
Right.
to give to various projects. So I've seen a lot of activists calling for Biden in these last couple months to fuck it, declare the climate emergency, start doling out funds, because once you start doling out funds, it's very hard to take them away. And it's very unpopular to take them away. The other thing is just there's a lot of money grant money that from the IRA that hasn't been rewarded. So I've seen a lot of activists calling for Biden to dole out those grants as fast as possible, because again, once you give away money, it's very hard to take it away. And it becomes, particularly for these Republican states, like I think it might be smart for him to keep giving money to projects that are, renewable projects, battery projects, solar projects in Republican states. The other thing is like there's one cop left, with the Biden administration. I don't think that anything that the U.S. agrees to at the next international climate negotiations is going to mean anything, just because Trump can, and I think I would bet a lot of money that he would immediately roll those pledges back. But I think that knowing that the U.S. does have sway with other countries, like really being aggressive about diplomacy and pressuring, trying to get other countries to make big commitments.
Okay.
And then also, like, I think this is a time for some deep reflecting and soul searching among people who care about climate change, about how we interact and build community with people, because obviously it did not work this time.
Yeah.
Concerns about climate change did not mobilize people, despite it being a very obvious factual connection between these two candidates. Look, I was never a Kamala Harris fan. I mean, I've never been a fan of any politician, really, but there was a tangible difference that you could map out, that one would bring you like a little bit closer to having a safe climate, and one would bring you much further away. So I think that there has to be a lot of soul searching in this time about like, how do climate activists and people who care about climate change build coalition with people who have decided to abandon the Democratic Party, or just abandon the idea of national organizing for climate change at all. Because I bet you, just looking at those numbers and shifts of people who voted for Trump, I mean, I am sure that not every single one of those people is a climate denier. You know, I've been speaking to movement leaders recently, and one of the more interesting things that I heard was just that this election really shows how like the coalition cannot just be liberals and leftists, because at the most those people make up what, 45% of the population. And even if you got all those people to vote, it still didn't matter. The coalition that Donald Trump has built has been massively diverse this time around, which I think was like the more shocking thing.
Yeah.
And another really interesting thing I heard was that like the IRA is essentially a corporate giveaway. That's our biggest climate policy ever. So why, you know, and R by R, I mean the US. That's the US's biggest climate policy ever. So why didn't it, and it doled out hundreds of millions of dollars, right? So why didn't it move people to vote for Biden the way that like Obamacare mobilized people to reelect Obama, right? And one of the theories that I've been constantly hearing is that it's because the money went to solar CEOs, and battery CEOs, and it was corporate giveaway money, right? And the assumption was that that money would then trickle down to workers.
Oh, really?
Right? But when you hear that, you're like, well, that kind of sounds Republican-y, doesn't it?
Doesn't it?
Doesn't it? And so, like, forgive people if they don't feel like climate policy is helping the American worker at a time when most American workers are suffering.
Yeah.
So I found that all very interesting. You know, Democrats abandoned the concept of a Green New Deal because it was getting too much flack from the right. But the Green New Deal was about giving jobs to people.
Yeah.
It was about making everybody a part of a clean energy economy. It wasn't about corporate giveaways. So a lot of working people felt affected by this Democratic Party. And I think that like the strategy of corporate giveaway climate policy is probably one of the reasons. And I think that in the next couple months before, Trump actually takes office, it would really benefit people who care about climate change to really think about that.
Amazing. I've got one final question for you before you have to go. And that is, what does media need to do differently in the United States to prevent or at least try and stop the rise of fascist dictators?
I think we need to become fascists. I think we all need to start podcasts. I think we need to start saying shit that's not true all the time, but that sounds awesome. And I think we all need podcasts. I think we all need to just start going, like, losing our absolute minds. No, I don't mean this, but sometimes I think of, like, sometimes in, like, the deep, dark recesses of, like, how do we combat this? I'm like, well, why don't I just say crazy stuff that doesn't make any sense? I'll just make a TikTok and I'll say anything.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this, and I don't have the answer, but I'll give you just like something that I've been thinking about, which is, I think maybe even in climate spaces, the idea of focusing on climate change when it's something that people aren't making tangible connections to their daily lives or to the daily struggle that they're feeling, they kind of feel patronized to and talked down to. And like, you have to care about this thing that like I can't see. And then you're like, well, it's happening right now. Like, you just can't see it. And you're like, well, don't call me dumb. And you're like, I'm not calling you dumb, but it is happening.
Yeah.
So I think number one, there just needs to be a lot more coverage connecting the daily problems that people are seeing in their lives: inflation, food prices, inability to purchase a home, rising costs of insurance, to really connect those things to climate change and make it more visible. Because, yeah, like maybe people can't see it, but I don't think that media does an incredibly good job making those, highlighting those things. And I include myself. Like I've tried, but it just hasn't been a focus of my coverage. And that's partially because of the audience that I have. I'm pretty sure my audience like kind of knows it, but it would be good to increase knowledge of that. Because even me, it's like, how much can I connect the issues that everyday people are facing to climate change? I can a little bit, but I know, because I've seen there's like a lot of research backing those things up. The second thing is that, I went to a panel during Climate Week where somebody made this point. I thought it was really interesting about if the problem is fossil fuels, right? That's the thing that is driving climate change, number one. Does the discussion about fossil harm always have to center around climate change? If that's not something that a lot of people are receptive to. Now, I have historically been like very like, fuck these arguments about like, maybe try to work your way into climate change or like around it. I've sort of been like, no. That's like, I'm not going to avoid this, talking about this problem just because a bunch of people have politicized it so much that it's difficult to talk about. And I don't think the answer is to stop talking about the problem, but I do think maybe the answer is to increase the ways we talk about the problems of fossil fuels. I think a lot of us, I can just speak about myself, once I realized that the problem of climate change was like primarily driven by fossil fuels, I was like, oh, okay, so then I have to focus my coverage on fossil fuels. But every single story doesn't have to be about the climate problems of fossil fuels because there are tons of other problems with them, right? Like there are tons of other problems that I think like more people, at least a broader spectrum of people, can associate with. I mean, plastics, like tons of the RFK Jr. people hate plastics and they voted for big plastic. It's the communication around that, like plastics and chemicals and air pollution and like what's happening in your brain. It's like for some reason the hyper wellness girlies, like there's who hate plastic have like gone with Trump. And you're like, oh, that's a failure, right? That's a failure of communication. So there needs to be more coverage of that as well. So those are two things I'm thinking of.
Excellent. Emily, thank you so much for coming and joining me on this very special emergency podcast and for making me laugh through it. Just awesome work. Really top dollar from you.
That's what I'm most proud of, is making you laugh. I'm so happy.
And we'll have to get you back on the show when the dust has settled to talk more generally about your work, which is phenomenal.
Sure.
Great.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It was nice to be here.
Lovely to have you. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.